Hello, welcome once again to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada, and in this opportunity we'll be speaking with Salvador Tió, who is a human rights lawyer and an active member of the independent movement in Puerto Rico. Welcome, Salvador.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Let's start right forward. It's been more than a year that Puerto Rico suffered the impact of Hurricane Maria, and the one that hit the island, the strongest that hit the island in the recent years.
Yes.
How is Puerto Rico recovering?
Well, Puerto Rico has had two hurricanes, and the worst one had happened before Maria. It's the Fiscal Control Board. Puerto Rico has a very difficult time recovering. There are a significant amount of homes still with the blue ceilings, which means they're plastic things. FEMA, who came there to help, basically was making a bundle, making a lot of money, even downing trees that were in good shape because they could sell them very expensively because it's very good quality wood. We have a government, we have an attitude, as everybody saw Mr. Trump throwing paper to the people in Puerto Rico, as that really, and joking and making fun of the governor of Puerto Rico, who is for statehood. Something that we have been a colony of them for 120 years, and they have never indicated that they would be willing to consider for Puerto Rico. Let me tell you, if I were them, I wouldn't give it either, consider it, because we're not Americans, we're Puerto Ricans, we're Latin American people. No matter what political party you belong to, it's very clear. And anybody who knows salsa understands where we're coming from. So it's bad. However, there is a movement in Puerto Rico. I think that for agriculture, agroecological. Similarly here, there is a movement like that. In both places, it is still in its sort of nascent times, because Puerto Rico, which was a significant agricultural producer, that ended with the hegemony of sugarcane in the first half of the 20th century. And we then developed an industrialization program, and most of the factories that came in left. So what we have now is something that is not conducive to development, but is essentially an extraction. They say we owe them $83 billion. Now, if you divide that by 3 million people who still reside in the island, that would be equivalent of having a mortgage on your life for the next 3 generations. And it is really, there's no possibility of full recovery in Puerto Rico as long as we are still remaining under a colonial domination of the United States.
Talking about that debt also, prior to the hurricane impact, Borinquen was dragging a debt of $70 million. And it's estimated that with the damage caused by Maria, that figure is duplicated.
You say our debt was $70 billion.
Billion.
Billion. They say it is our debt.
What is the current economic and social situation in the island?
Poverty has risen. People are leaving in droves.
Why?
Because there are no jobs for many people who went to, the people who are leaving the island are the younger people. They are going to Florida. Kissimmee, right next to Orlando, has more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans right now. There are more Puerto Ricans in the United States than in Puerto Rico. There's 4.5, perhaps, million Puerto Ricans in the United States, and there's only 3.1 million in Puerto Rico. So the population has reduced and continues reducing itself because there is no sense that there is an opportunity there. The doctors are leaving the island. There are some specialties that you can hardly find anybody who will be able to treat you. If Puerto Rico is completely dominated by the Congress of the United States, all the laws and the Constitution of the United States applies in Puerto Rico. And we do not vote, neither for the president nor for any congressperson with vote. It is a colony in the worst possible sense, and a neo-colony also. So all the forms of domination are, and in addition to that, one of the few instances that Puerto Ricans have to receive a vision of what is happening in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico, different from the one that CNN would like us to have, is Telesur. And Telesur is not available directly on TV. You have to subscribe to DirecTV because Liberty Cable does not include Telesur in Puerto Rico. DirecTV is not for everybody. It costs too much for a majority of the people in Puerto Rico. The radio stations are completely controlled by other people who do not espouse or talk about the problems of the Caribbean like we are doing today. They are basically doing propaganda in support of the United States and their presence in Puerto Rico. There is a chain of drug companies called Walgreens. Puerto Rico has more Walgreens per capita and per mile than any place on earth. They have done away with a lot of the smaller pharmacies, not all of them. How can they do that? Well, Puerto Rico had laws that it had established, and this is an example of how it works, which required that anybody who wants to set up a drugstore has to obtain a certificate of need for that, because if there's already another one there, that would not be the place to give you a permit to do it. Well, the federal court in Puerto Rico declared that to be unconstitutional because it violated the Commerce Clause, which requires that there be free flow and free commerce. Why do they do that? The federal court in Puerto Rico, well, after all the judges are Puerto Rican. Yes, but they want statehood. They think that statehood will happen. It'll never happen. The only way it could happen is if they finally succeed in taking everybody away. Now, how are they proposing to resolve that problem? By privatizing more. They already privatized the airport, which belongs to companies, Aerostar. We're talking about Carlos Slim, who also owns the Cancun airport and was interested in owning the Mexico City airport, which now, with Lopez Obrador, is, who knows what's going to happen with that. It's not very clear to me yet. They are privatizing the highways and increasing what you pay every time you go by in a toll. They are giving it to companies outside. They want to they are privatizing the energy producing. We have a very good state-owned energy company, but they have a strong union. They want to do away with unions. UTIER has been on the forefront as one of the most significant unions in Puerto Rico, which has been combative and has been representing the interests of the people. Now, of course, their own interests. Well, they want to deal them out of the equation. Puerto Rico has fiber optic that belongs to Puerto Rico. They want to give it to the Americans or to whatever company comes in there. So the people who are in power, imagine if the right wing were still in power completely in Venezuela as it used to be. People who are completely committed to making some money themselves by allowing American and foreign interests to basically dominate the situation here. Well, that's precisely why Chavismo and why ultimately, almost 20 years ago, things changed forever. Because I don't think that even though there are such difficult times happening here right now, there's some things that the people have learned that they're not going to forget about. But Puerto Rico still hasn't learned that completely. Why? Well, because what they read on the papers, all the papers, all of them, except maybe a weekly paper here with like Claridad, or a paper that is in Ponce, which is for local, called La Perla del Sur, which is the name for Ponce, which is the second largest city in Puerto Rico. Beyond that, most of what you get is pablum, completely controlled by the media, which basically espouses neoliberal policies and attacks, and independentistas do not have any voice. Like me, we don't have any voice. If somebody wants to,
why they don't have any voice?
Because the Americans made independence a crime. What was Oscar Lopez Rivera, who spent more than 30 years in prison and just came out last year, what was he accused of? Seditious conspiracy.
I was going to ask you about
his
figures.
What is seditious conspiracy? The struggle for independence. Who was accused for seditious conspiracy? Jesus Christ, Nelson Mandela, Pedro Albizu Campos, was accused of seditious conspiracy in 1936. It was a crime in Puerto Rico to have the Puerto Rican flag alone. The Puerto Rican flag can be seen in Puerto Rico in public buildings since 1952, but not alone. It has to be right next to the American flag. I remember when I went to University of Puerto Rico in the 60s, that having, as I did and some of us had, the Puerto Rican flag sticker on your car or on whatever you moved in or in your handbag, the police would stop you. Houses were invaded. And if they found an American flag, a Puerto Rican flag in your house, they would send you to jail. In fact, one of the things that I would like to promote here is to bring and I have meetings, I'm not going to mention right now with who, to bring documentaries that have been produced in the last couple of years about Puerto Rico, which are very good, which talk about this, particularly in this particular case that I'm talking to you, a couple of them, or maybe 3 of them, that relate to the uprising of 1950, when Puerto Ricans not only went to the governor's house, the Nationalist Party did that, but they also went to kill President Truman in 1950, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola. Now, they went to kill, but they didn't go to kill really. The main object was not to kill the president. The main objective there was to immolate themselves. And one of them died and the other one almost died. Why? Because the Americans were saying that what was happening in Puerto Rico was a conflict between Puerto Ricans, but it was the U.S. military that was bombing through the Puerto Rico National Guard, which they controlled. They bombed the town of Jayuya in 1950 when the uprising. And there's a documentary which has come out this year, which is excellent, which I want to bring here with other 4 or 5 documentaries, but not just Puerto Rico, to have it from the entire region of the Caribbean. We are part of the Caribbean. The fact that Puerto Rico is a colony and that Cuba is blockade, there's a blockade against Cuba, leaves only the Dominican Republic, ostensibly, as the only place that they ostensibly do not directly control. That's not true. They also control the Dominican Republic. After all, they invaded in 1965. And I do remember it well, because that was to me the most significant element, which told me personally that the United States it was impossible to entertain an agreement, an arrangement with the United States that would not ultimately result to their satisfaction in having them control the entire region. Venezuela, the frontier of Venezuela with the United States should not be the one that is right next to Trinidad. It should be Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. We are a region. We are the Caribbean. And if there's one thing clear with Bolivar and with Albizu and with Fidel and with Betances and the leadership of the independence movement in the Dominican Republic, was that they all had a vision of a confederation of the Antilles, of the larger islands, and of the Caribbean, ultimately. And that is why when, after, let's say, 2002, it became clear that Venezuela was becoming the spearhead through Chavez of a look towards, of a vision of a united America. That's what brought my attention to come here, and I have been a steady follower of what happens in Venezuela, because Venezuela is going through very hard times, but it's going through very hard times because it has been the spearhead for our liberation. Not just Venezuela's, it's the sovereignty of the entire region that is at stake. So I'm talking to you in the Caribbean, the English-speaking people, in Trinidad, in other islands, that we are not going to be able to be fully liberated from control by the U.S. banks and the U.S. companies.
I was going to ask you about that specifically before we arrive to specifically talking about Venezuela and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what is needed to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans to make a national and an international call to promote the independence of Puerto Rico? What is needed?
Well, part of what is needed is what we're doing now. What is needed essentially is that there is a consciousness developed, that people understand better what is their reality. That is very difficult to obtain in Puerto Rico. The joining of forces, the maintaining of the flow of information. I wouldn't be surprised if one day I wake up and I see that the Telesur is no longer being offered in Puerto Rico. Now, I always can have access to Telesur with this, because I was listening to it when I was in Europe through this. But not everybody has this, and with the capacity of interconnectedness. Besides, even though it shows, the people who look at it are not that many. I mean, I would like to see I'm sure that you have the statistics here of how many people tune in. Probably you can have access to that. We have to have a sense that Puerto Rico, to understand the importance of each island. It's not just Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico plays a very significant part. Because the Dominicans cannot go to Puerto Rico unless they give them permission, the Americans. We don't control the border. We cannot go to we can go to the Dominican Republic. And the Cubans can go to the Dominican Republic. No, but the Cubans cannot come to Puerto Rico unless they give them an opportunity. Why is that? Well, that plays into the handbook for control of the Caribbean, complete control of the Caribbean, that they have had. Why do they have Puerto Rico? Well, they wanted to control the Panama Canal. They started rebuilding the Panama Canal in 1903. Where did they find the solution to the problem which had enabled, this incapacitated the French from being able to finish the Panama Canal? It was the mosquito, but they didn't know that. They found out about that in Cuba. Where did they set up the mechanism to do, they did the mosquiteros. A mosquitero was one of the elements that they did the protocols. They did them in Puerto Rico. They started building the Panama Canal. Why do they want Puerto Rico? Well, Puerto Rico was the best place to defend the Panama Canal. That is how Roosevelt convinced in the Senate, with the war games that took place in the late 30s, which had the Germans go from the north of Brazil to capture the canal, and they from Norfolk, Virginia to prevent it. It was staged. The result was that they lost the canal. And that's how they justified the construction of the military base of Roosevelt Roads, which was Naval Armed Forces Caribbean, from which the submarines and ships left to fight the Second World War against the Germans, because it was always the Germans they thought wanted this. Before it had been the British. But it was the Germans, ultimately, because now the British and the Americans are sweethearts, are buddies.
Now, taking back the idea of Venezuela and the Caribbean, of the importance of the Caribbean, how would you qualify the anti-imperialist and integrationist process that have been developing in the last decade in Latin America and the Caribbean, like with ALBA, for example?
Well, it is now in retreat. It was all of it was very possible, very positive, I mean. But what is happening with CELAC? The OEA, La OEA, is trying to create problems for Venezuela. You have to, Chancellor Ariasa having to defend things which he shouldn't be in a position to have to defend, and similarly his predecessor, the woman. ALBA, well, what is happening in Brazil? What is happening in Argentina? What is happening in Chile? We are, the empire has struck back. They tried earlier, it didn't work with Bush. Bush's son, the third, was good for Latin America because he was not as adroit as Hillary and Obama. Obama was able to undertake a soft coup in Honduras. And it was with them also that they strengthened the situation against Dilma and Lula in Brazil. And it was under them that Macri was able to get into Argentina. Now, obviously, each country has the power and the right to elect their own people.
I want to ask you two questions. One, what will happen in Venezuela this 10th of January? With all this great media campaign justifying and military intervention against Venezuela. And the other question that I want to ask you is, what takes for the Caribbean and Latin American to be fully integrated? I want you to answer me those two questions very, very shortly.
I think that the invasion, there's not going to be an invasion on the 10th. Not by the United States. I don't think they would dare do that right now. Although with Trump, it is impossible to predict because he only cares about himself. And if he thinks that invading Venezuela at this time would end up being positive for him in terms of avoiding jail or having the people start praising him because he's being tough, but I don't see that happening. They have been training people in Colombia, and they have trained people also in Mexico, and they have trained people in the United States. And it varies because the higher class people go to Mexico and the lower class people go to Colombia. The same people who organize the guarimbas here. So I think we can expect some type of activity. I'm going to be here. I'm not going back to Puerto Rico. I'm going to be here on the 10th. I want to be present when whatever they're going to try to do, and they're going to be doing something. But,
do you think so? They're going to try to do something?
Something. That doesn't mean that they're going to invade. But didn't they use a drone? Yes. They don't have to invade. They can do something to attract attention. I don't know what they're thinking, but they are no dummies. And they have a lot of people who used to be in the military coordinating what they do. And the guarimbas that they set up here they almost toppled the government. I don't know why they couldn't follow through with it. Maybe because they have a political problem. They have not been able to reestablish the coalition of the ADECOS, or the two-party system that the ADECOS had with the COPEI. Chavismo became too strong. And I don't think it has weakened to the level which they thought they would be able to do it. My heart goes out to the Venezuelan people because I know the difficult time that people are going through here. I see the lines of people being able to pay. There's a scarcity of cash in the banks. People have to be paying with cards. And people it's not easy. We have it easy as compared to what you have here right now, and we're a colony. But what you have is the spirit of Chavez. And Chavez still lives.
With that idea, with the people's pushing forward for the development and the union and the integration of the region, we have to sadly end up this interview.
Good.
Thank you very much, Salvador.
Thank you. Thank you.
Like this, we've come to the end of this special interview from Caracas with Salvador Tió, who is an human rights lawyer and an active member of the independence movement in Puerto Rico.